The main thing is to be yourself and not allow people to disturb you, to be different because they want you to be different. You gotta be yourself. Many times it's through a mistake due to your own personality or your own character or interference that you get on the way that you learn. And the main thing is to make sure you learn through your mistakes and get better. I believe in the ability of focusing strongly in something, then you're able to extract even more out of it.
The pale yellow sun rose sharply and expandingly over the top edge of the concrete grandstand. The riding people scurrying among the transport vehicles, which are located right next to the pits. People who, in a sense, aren't going anywhere, jostling, waiting. Winter morning, 10:30. Something happens and nothing really happens. Someone wearing a roadman's jacket like a uniform explains emphatically, "Don't let anyone talk to him. No questions. Absolutely no questions." Wherever he goes these days, there is only a clear feeling. He is under siege. He arrived as if from nowhere, also wearing a roadman's jacket, a new uniform for him, a man of average height with a shock of dark curly hair. He remains calm and answers any unexpected questions without ever losing his calmness and prudence. He has a soft smile that never leaves his face. Estoril, January 1994. He already tested the Williams Renault a day ago. Today he is doing a Demoralizer 2 for about 350 journalists and photo reporters to witness. He doesn't overload either himself or the car. The next day the siege ended. Most of the journalists went home. He takes the first steps towards getting to know the car, its engine, and the team. He will calmly explain that each advancement through the decade so long ago was a start in Formula One. At Toleman, from Toleman to Lotus, from Lotus to McLaren, gave a boost to his career. Acceleration. Here will be the next stage. Morning. There are still no cars on the track. A feeling of emptiness and something languid. An empty racetrack is a strange contradiction. It's only at the starting line that excitement begins as he poses with his new teammate, Damon Hill, and his new car. The arc of a photojournalist is so large that photojournalists take photos of photojournalists and magazines place them, deliberately planning to continue the siege. Estoril's choice to start Senna at Williams was entirely coincidental. Estoril is a favorite place for drivers to train, usually warm and dry. However, on these January days the sun was barely warm. Here, in 1984, Niki Lauda won the World Championship, an event of such magnitude that before the Portuguese Grand Prix, some drivers said they were moving out of his way so as not to be seen as interfering with the living legend. But Senna said that he wouldn't go out of his way. Both the living legend and he would need it. Here, in the second race of 1985, he determined to take Lotus home for its first win and team first place finish after 3 dry years. The tipsy mechanics danced with delight. He explained,
"Everyone thought I was in complete control of the car, but at one point I rolled onto the grass with all 4 wheels. My fate was completely in God's hands."
Here, in 1988, just a year later, Nigel Mansell didn't see the black flag. The McLaren repair crew were trying to tell Senna, "Don't take Mansell into account, he's out of the race now." They collided and a loud quarrel followed. Here, in 1991, Mansell pit stop to change tires went hopelessly wrong. The tire began to come off as he began to accelerate down the track from the repair station, and he had to stop right at the pit wall. This virtually guaranteed Senna a 3rd World Championship title. Now, on this cool January day in 1994, he will say,
"I believe, even after spending 10 years in Formula One and winning 3 world championships, that the opportunity to learn and improve is the biggest motivating factor for me. As you move on, each year it becomes more and more difficult to force yourself to do a number of things that you usually don't enjoy. Hard, tedious work in regular winter training, for example. So these big changes in my career are like someone changing their place of residence. You must find out everything, put everything in order, prepare yourself for this, get to know your new neighbors and make new friends. This is a way to force yourself to maintain the form that Formula One requires of you.
The official presentation of Ayrton Senna after he moved to the Williams team from Melbourne McLaren, replacing the departed Prost, took place in October 1993. A little strange and chaotic, unlike an unusual day at the end of January. There isn't even a pale yellow sun. Senna left McLaren and Prost didn't return. Subconsciously, like an empty pit lane in Estoril, you try to imagine them, to hear their peculiar manner of speech. Instead, you see Ayrton Senna looking somewhere deep into the track. What is he thinking about? Analyzing his best time? Maybe. At least he definitely doesn't think that he closed the circle 11 years after his first meeting with Williams and his first day behind the wheel of Formula One car. He became wiser and more reasonable. A completely different person stood in front of us. One thing remained unchanged: his desire to win, to achieve what he wants, just like the same boy driving a cart with a lawnmower engine. Yeah, only a few people are able to find their path in childhood and not deviate from it in the future. This is exactly what baby Beco was like. He was born to Milton and Naida Senna da Silva at 2:35 a.m. on March 21, 1960, at the Primatree Hospital in Sao Paulo. And at baptism he was given the name Ayrton Senna da Silva. His sister Vivian was born 2 years earlier. His brother Leonardo was born later. You and I know the great racer as Ayrton Senna, but his family had a different name for him, Beco. There's a story in this regard. He was originally nicknamed Kaneko, which means beer mug. Although no one in the family knows exactly why he was given such a nickname. It's a secret, they say. As a children, Ayrton and Vivian used to play a lot with their cousin, who couldn't pronounce Kaneko properly, and he shortened it to Beco, so the nickname stuck. In his early years, Ayrton showed no signs that he could become the prodigy of precision and concentration who would haunt the world of motorsport. Nadia and Vivian witnessed daily his clumsy behavior and the alarming frequency of falls, trips and head hits, some of which were so severe that they left large marks on his body and bumps on his head. At that time in Brazil, being left-handed was a cause for concern even for educators. Beco was such an active child from birth that when he was 4 years old, Milton built him a small go-kart. Yeah, it could be one of the passing hobbies like trains, pony riding or piano lessons, which is what children at this age usually do. It could have been, but it didn't. As Milton worked on the karts, and little Beco watched very closely, the history of auto racing itself began to change. A new passion was born in the boy's soul. Reflecting many years later, Ayrton explained his philosophy.
The only motivation to race with passion, with desire, with determination is first and foremost the belief that you can win. We don't need myths. We need role models, examples of courage, determination, faith. We must not only believe that it is possible to win, but it is also our duty to fight for victory.
From a very early age, Ayrton showed that he was born to race. His tiny pedal jeep was one of the first cars he ever drove and was his favorite toy. Little Beco's activity and energy were a nightmare for the market sellers. He was banned from going shopping with his mother because of a small incident at the orange shop. He bumped into boxes and scattered oranges, which rolled down the slope of the road. Yeah, this boy liked to be in constant motion from a very early age. Ayrton's family recalls the most typical example. When they bought shoes for him, he saw nothing but boots. Having chosen the appropriate model, Beco put them on, ran around inside the store, and stopped abruptly as if he was trying to check the brakes. If the shoes slipped, he considered them bad and tried on another pair. But let's get back to the cart. Little Beco's father, Milton, was an entrepreneur who owned a business in the metallurgical industry, as well as an automobile parts factory. He was also in love with the world of cars. Perhaps it was this love that he wanted to share with a small but very active and persistent boy. Having received his Swiss card at the age of 4, Ayrton didn't stop racing around the clock from morning until night. It took Milton 6 months to assemble the cart. All this time, Beco froze and carefully watched his father and noted every detail. This habit remained with him throughout his entire career. He never took his watchful eye off what the team was doing with his car.
Ayrton could be in the garage until 4 o'clock in the morning, showing me his cart. He assembled it, took it apart, and assembled it again. From a technical point of view, he knew everything about it.
Alfredo Patesca, a childhood friend. The cart named 007 after the success of the James Bond film had only 3 horsepower with a lawnmower engine and could easily accelerate the little race up to 60 km per hour. This car remained his dream car until he was 7 years old. As he got older, he started racing on a professional kart. Senna recalled that he raced only for himself, for his own pleasure, and had no idea about racing cars or racing champions.
I didn't know who I was, it was just fun. I moved my foot from the gas to the brake and enjoyed driving.
Ayrton was a very determined child. One day Nida took him and Vivian to see the cartoon Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Vivian really wanted to watch this cartoon, but not baby Beco. He sat gloomily until the scene when the witch gives Snow White the poisoned apple.
Mom, I want that apple,
said Ayrton.
Later.
Nida answered in a whisper, so as not to disturb anyone from watching the movie. After 2 minutes of silence, Beco spoke again, but a little louder.
Mom, I want apple.
Wait a little longer.
Mom whispered again.
After the cartoon, I'll buy you as many apples as you want, but now sit quietly and watch the cartoon.
Mom, I want exactly that apple.
The deed was done, and all 3 left the cinema without finishing watching the cartoon. The family also recalls another funny incident when little Ayrton's determination and firmness of intentions appeared. They were all invited to a birthday party at their cousin's house. It was raining, Beco was 5 years old, and Nida was helping him to dress up while Vivian was doing it on her own. They walked to the car, cleanly and neatly dressed and pregnant, to go on a visit. Beco, always in a hurry, ran ahead of everyone and opened the passenger door. Having climbed into the car, he decided that he must sit in the driver's seat. Ayrton climbed onto it and sat down, leaning his back on the driver's door. The door wasn't locked. He leaned on it so hard that it opened and the baby helplessly fell out of the car into a puddle. Vivian laughed so hard that she couldn't hardly breathe. But Nida was probably not so funny at that moment, since she had to take Ayrton into the house and dress him again. What can I say? All his birthday parties were unpredictable because he could always do something wrong. When Beco turned 6, he said that he wanted to gather a large company for a holiday. He didn't want to gather an ordinary company. It had to be huge. Since he had been behaving well lately, Nida said that he could invite everyone he wanted to see. At about 4:30 p.m., children began to gather for celebration, boys and girls of different ages. Milton began to count everyone, but lost his way when the number of children exceeded 30. He taught the children to play leapfrog, and everyone had a lot of fun. After the guests had left, Nada asked Beco how he had so many friends, to which he calmly replied,
I didn't know everyone. I just walked down our street, rang the doorbell and invited the children to the birthday party.
Even as a child, if he wanted something to happen, he always knew the ways. Not surprisingly, this also applied to cars. At the age of 10, while relaxing on the beach, Ayrton, unnoticed by everyone, got behind the wheel of his father's car. Holding the steering wheel, he stretched out to reach the pedals. In this position, his eyes saw just above the dashboard panel, and, turning on the gear, took off. Raising dust from the road, he pressed the pedals by feel, barely reaching them with his toes. Ayrton was always smart and wasn't afraid of difficulties. He drove heavy tractors and trucks on the family farm, changing gears without using the clutch. He did it the same way as they did on jeeps. Listen until the engine noise tells you the right moment to shift. Ayrton also performed this trick on his Suzuki 180 motorcycle. Knowing everything we know, we really want to see true manifestation of talent in these moments. But even without knowing what will happen next, one thing is obvious. Ayrton always adored speed. He spent a lot of time on a Rolima sled, riding with friends. These are bearing sleds. Usually they are assembled from a wooden base and bearings. Children assemble sleds to ride down the slope. Traditionally, these sleds were very light and agile, and were made for riding in line or sitting position. Everything that came to hand was used as wheels, but most often these were wheel bearings. Beco spent a lot of time training and honing his handling techniques, trying to go as fast as possible, wherever possible. Thanks to this practice, he was able to go a few seconds faster on a makeshift street circuit in the Santana district of Sao Paulo. Their house stood on a hill. Contemporaries claimed that on the descent down to the main road it was possible to develop a decent speed. Ayrton first went to a karting track with his father when he was 11 years old. Even if it was raining, Beco insisted on getting out and doing a few laps. The track surface was as slippery as a wet, so polished board. He slid with all his wheels but never lost control. Again, to see the great truth in this is a temptation that is difficult to resist, but still, let's not get ahead of ourselves. His son's obsession with the world of cars convinced Milton to build a garage in the parking lot of his home. Ayrton himself would later say,
I believe that by concentrating hard on something you can achieve better results. It's been like this all my life. Over time, the only question became how to improve this ability. Moving forward is not limited. You just keep achieving more and more.
At the age of 13, Ayrton took part in his first go-kart race on a makeshift circuit in Campinas, a city in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo. He led from start to finish. There is a delightful contradiction in this, since Ayrton himself claims that he had already raced with much older boys a few years earlier.
I asked my father if he would allow me to also participate, because I was 8 or 9, there were guys with 20, 25, 18, and my father was a bit scared, of course, and he eventually said okay. And starting the grid position was established by drawing a piece of paper inside the helmet. So they put all the numbers there, grid position, and because I was the little one, they told me, you take the first one to choose. take the number, and I took number 1. So I was on pole position. And that was really my first taste of competition. But it was only a game. And I remember I led 35 laps out of 40 because my go-kart was too fast for them. I was big advantage being light. And eventually the last 5 laps I was second or third. And the guy behind me, who was much faster than me on the corners, could not overtake me on the straight. Eventually he hit me from the back and I went off the circuit. And so I didn't finish, but it was good fun, good memories.
The first official Brazilian Grand Prix took place at Interlagos in 1973. Brazilian Emerson Fittipaldi, competing in the race, defended his world title. Milton took Ayrton with him, and Fittipaldi would later remember how fast he brought a child to see him, and this boy was Ayrton Senna himself. Thus began a friendship that lasted a lifetime and grew stronger over the times. Young Beco's karting career was impeccable. He adjusted the racing trajectory on the track with millimeter precision and was always trying to improve his times. Lap after lap, striving to make every corner perfectly, almost on the verge of drifting due to the centrifugal force at work. He took the corners again and again, achieving incredible precision and complete error-free performance throughout the entire distance. Ayrton only changed his line when another rider tried to overtake him. He drove the kart with his left hand, since he was left-handed, while regulating the engine speed with his right hand, creating his own style and tirelessly repeating that karting was a very important phase in his training in the racing craft. He devoted 17 years to karting, starting at age 4 and finishing with his last attempt at the 1982 World Championship. Ayrton's karts were prepared by Lucio Pascal, a Spaniard by birth, the first time Senna himself came to his workshop near Interlagos. Over time, the master tried to explain to Ayrton that sometimes you need to race with your foot tactically and more prudently, but Senna immediately rejected this idea. He said that every time he goes to start only for the sake of victory and he doesn't accept anything else. He maintained this attitude towards racing throughout his career.
Losing for him was already bad, and losing against me was really the worst thing he could have.
For him, be second, he was the first of the losers. He just hated that. It was nothing for him but winning. He just wanted to psych his opposition that they all think that Senna was in front of them. He had to be quickest all the time.
Ayrton would enter a corner faster than he'd ever been before and trust that something inside Ayrton Senna would help get him and the car around the corner. And that's an act of trust or faith or whatever you want to call it.
He prepared his chance, but when it was there, he took it. And when you want to correct it, no way. That was a crash, you know. So in the end of the day, when you saw the yellow helmet, you know you're in trouble.
Yeah, this helmet was Ayrton's identification card. It brought him recognition in karting and was with him throughout his entire career. Almost everything that Ayrton acquired during his karting days remained with him.
I met Ayrton when he was just a boy racing karts. At that time, I was already drawing helmets for Fittipaldi, the Formula One champion, and for Nelson Piquet. Ayrton also wanted to be recognized. I decided that a warm color would suit him, like Ferrari red. And I made this yellow helmet with 2 blue and green eye stripes. They were supposed to create a sense of movement and aggression. I decided to use the colors of our country, yellow, green, blue, and white. Ayrton loved my design and it was his signature throughout his career.
Sid Mosca. Despite the fact that Ayrton was passionate about racing, the question of his education remained open, and sometimes this caused problems. He wasn't the best student in the class, but he could certainly absorb information very easily. Yeah, he didn't study his homework, but he was very attentive in class. Ayrton could talk quickly and to the point. He studied only to pass the exams at the end of the year. The real knowledge he acquired focused on the dream of becoming racing. The world of karting isn't well covered in the press except for the occasional specialist magazine, and a dedicated karting driver who took part in a number of races on a historic scale will remain unknown and forgotten. The young karting driver lives only in the present. One way or another, it's impossible to compile a complete list of Ayrton's karting races. And probably even if you try to compile it, in reality there will be much more races. What we do know is that he was the São Paulo Junior Champion in 1974 and was also the South American Champion in 1977. In retrospect, it's safe to say that Ayrton took a decisive step forward in 1978, flying to Europe to compete for the World Karting Championship at Le Mans, the karting track that is located inside the famous circuit where the legendary 24-hour race is held. Ayrton flew to Milan because he was to perform for the DAP team, formerly called Parilla. DAP was a brand created when its owners, Angelo Parilla and his brother, sold the brand to the Argentine company. The company was a leading manufacturer in Italy of a long karting tradition, and Angelo Parilla went to the airport to meet Senna. He spoke no English at that time, and they communicated in a marvelous mixture of Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and some English. Milton called Angelo and said that Ayrton only liked Brazilian cuisine, and even when he visited South American countries, he didn't eat anything until he returned home. Therefore, upon Senna's arrival, Angelo took him to a very expensive restaurant, where Ayrton quickly swallowed everything that was ordered and asked if it could be repeated. Parilla laughed and replied that he couldn't afford it. Thus began another strong friendship. Ayrton immediately made an impression at the karting test in Parma, Italy, on a very difficult track. Soon enough, he was posting the same lap times as the very experienced karting driver Terry Fullerton, whom Angelo Parilla thought was amazing. Senna and Fullerton soon became rivals, which led to an amusing incident. A few years later, when Ayrton was asked on Brazilian television who he thought was the best driver he had ever raced with, the correspondent, thinking of course that Senna would name one of the great Grand Prix drivers, Alain Prost, Niki Lauda, Nelson Piquet, or Nigel Mansell, was simply shocked by the answer.
Fullerton. Name Fullerton.
Karting life continued at Le Mans, where Senna finished 6th, partly because Parilla was unable to find the best type of Bridgestone tire for him. Immediately after the championship, Ayrton and the team flew to Suga, Japan, to participate in another race. But it all ended with a mistake with tires, and in the end he finished 4th. Senna said he would return next year to take part in the championship again. He returned his racing suit to Parilla to take to Italy and store until his return. With this, he flew from Japan to his native Brazil. The 79 championship was held in Estoril, Portugal, and as Angelo said a week or two before Ayrton's arrival, they decided to have his overalls cleaned. And when Ayrton arrived and saw this, he burst into tears. He never expected that strangers would care about him so much. Senna flew to Europe in May and, in the 5 months leading up to the World Championship, took part in test runs in San Marino, Switzerland and Italy in September. Before the Italian race, Ayrton completed a few laps and returned to the pit lane.
One front tire is bigger than the other.
he told Angela.
No, it's impossible.
And I say, one tire is bigger.
They decided to check, and Ayrton was right. One tire actually turned out to be larger than the other by a millimeter. Barile was simply shocked. As the championships in Estoril, the point system was changed. Following the unwritten rule in motorsport, if something looks too simple, it needs to be complicated. After the finish, Senna thought he had won, but the victory went to someone else. When Angelo told Ayrton that according to the new system he was only second, the boy burst into tears. The 1980 World Championship were held in Nivelles, Belgium, and again he was only second. Senna was closely watched that day by an 11-year-old German boy and his family, who lived near the German-Belgian border and came just to watch. The boy's name was Michael Schumacher. Despite failing to win the World Championship, a fact that would greatly irritate him later, Ayrton and his family had a decision to make. He was already 20 and quite an adult. Karting driver Chico Serra, also a native of São Paulo, was 3 years older than Senna. He went to the United Kingdom to begin a career in auto racing with the Van Diemen factory team, which began competing in the Ford 1600 Formula. The team was managed by Ralph Furman, and Serra once told him about a fast man from São Paulo. Furman immediately began asking when the fast man would arrive. Yep, Ayrton and his family had to make a decision. He began taking management courses, but soon abandoned them to go to the United Kingdom and race in the Ford 1600 Formula. The idea for him to run the family business with his father. However, his disappointment with this prospect in life was obvious. His parents saw his despondency and knew that the young man could achieve much more if approached from a racing perspective. After lengthy discussion of numerous options, a difficult decision was made. Ayrton was allowed to fulfill his dream of becoming a racing driver, despite the fact that for this he would have to be very far from his family and homeland. On a cold winter morning in 1981, a dark-haired young man stopped his car outside a small building on the London Norwich Road in the Snetterton, and after a moment's hesitation, walked towards the door. To get here, he traveled halfway around the world, but this was only the beginning of a long journey. The young man was soon turned 21. His name was Ayrton da Silva, and he arrived in England from Brazil. The door he opened led to the office of Ralph Furman, the owner of England's strongest Formula Ford racing team, Van Diemen. Almost all young Britons raving about the lowers of Jim Clark and Jackie Stewart in those years sooner or later inevitably knocked on this door. And not only the British. In recent years, many young men have been here, whose idols were fellow countrymen Juan Manuel Fangio and Emerson Fittipaldi. Moreover, every year there were more and more Latinas: Pace, Morena, Bozell. Ayrton, as it turned out, was already known in Snetterton.
I remember when the Brazilian Chico Serra was racing with us in '77, he constantly talked about a guy named Ayrton Senna.
Recalls Ralph.
He will come, he will definitely come, Chico repeated. A couple of years later, Ayrton actually arrived, and when he first crossed the threshold of my office, I already knew enough about him. Chico has been buzzing my ears about how good Senna is. Despite this, when I first met Ayrton, he seemed overly self-confident to me. But after 10 minutes, I realized that this was not empty arrogance. This guy knew exactly what and how he needed to do to become a champion.
I would like to imagine him a little tired and serious, descending from the plane and looking at everything around him. He saw a cold country, the climate and cuisine of which he would never like. Yeah, it wasn't charming Italy at all. It was very, very grey. But the young man didn't come here alone. In February 1981, when he wasn't yet 21 years old, Senna married a friend of his youth, Lilian de Vasconcelos Souza. It was a union of two kindred spirits. At one time they even raced cars together. She was beautiful and very good cook, which was probably very useful for Ayrton, who loved Brazilian cuisine so much and missed it very much being far from home. And so two young people had to adapt to a new reality. A trip from London, 225 kilometers north to the East England city of Norwich, showed all the inherent characteristics of the country. East England looked like a tranquil landscape that had lain dormant for centuries. Ayrton must have felt very, very far from his beloved Brazil, but on the way to Norwich something important happened, and it was a sign. The young man's destination was a small factory south of Norwich. On the other side of the road leading to the racetrack, this close location of the plant and the highway wasn't accidental. Small racing cars produced by the factory could be tested and tested on the track. It was essentially an abandoned air base. American bombers flew from it during the Second World War. This is the most ordinary base with the most ordinary complex of buildings. But it was also the place where, during the rolling of endless miles on lonely, windy test days, the foundation of a future racing career is laid. The fanfare will come later in another place, if, of course, it happens at all. The young man who appeared before Ralph Ferdinand was probably a little shy by nature, but he knew exactly what he wanted, and there was no contradiction about it. He wanted to spend this year racing and he wanted to win. Ferdinand, Chico Serra and Senna went to lunch in a small oak-paneled restaurant attached to the hotel. When the conversation turned to business, another important event happened. Ferdinand made an offer that turned out to be quite acceptable, but whatever it was, Ayrton wanted more. Ferdinand offered him 30 test days, to which Senna objected. It got to the point that when Ayrton went to the restroom, Ferdinand asked Chico Serra,
"Who the hell is he?"
And that was a sign. They finally came to an agreement. They agreed that Ayrton would try his hand at all 3 British Formula 600 championships, run by the Royal Automobile Club and the shipping companies P&O and Thousand Forsen. Ayrton rented a house for himself and his young wife Lilian south of Norwich and began to slowly adapt to his new reality. Those first months were probably the most difficult in his life. He still spoke English poorly, and now he had to get used to many new things for him. Cars, both racing and road with right-hand drive, tracks, and even a new name. Ayrton the Silver raced under his mother's maiden name, Senna, but the British found this name too complicated, and the team simply adopted him Harry. Ayrton quickly got used to his new nickname, but with racing and overcoming the language barrier, everything turned out to be much more difficult. Although we must give him his due, the first was much easier for Harry than the second. It took time to get used to the new car and unfamiliar tracks. In those days, not all karting drivers switched to auto racing. Some stayed in karting forever. Others enjoyed it, having fun, weekends in their youth, then leaving to make a career in everyday life. It's not certain that a good karting driver could master a racing car or survive in the much more hostile environment of auto racing. And yet, it soon became clear that his years of karting had helped Ayrton, because when driving at high speed he could react intuitively and understand how to cope with it. But still, this doesn't fully explain how he could make this transition instantly. Several factors came together in Senna: a physical sense of every nuance of the behavior of a moving car, an intellect capable of transforming sensation into understanding and natural balance in everything he did, be it walking, running, playing football, water skiing, flying model airplanes, playing table tennis, and especially driving.
The karting experience, of course, helped me a lot, but mainly it only concerned driving in a crowd.
Senna later recalled.
In this respect, Formula Ford and karting are similar, but the basics of managing a formula are still too different from a kart.
When Ayrton raced with Ralph, his partners were two more Latin Americans, Mexican Alfonso Toledano and Argentine Enrique Mancilla. Once together with Senna, they posed for a photograph against the backdrop of green English forests. On the right is Toledano, short and the dark with a Marlboro advertisement. On the left is overalls with a lot of stripes in Mancilla. Between them is Ayrton, in one color overalls without a single logo, with the exception of perhaps the emblem of Brazil. He smiles, but this forced smile is clearly intended only for the photographer. Ralph asked Toledano to help with the translation, since Senna spoke a little Spanish and Toledano was completely native to Spanish. He also asked Mancilla, but national rivalries between Argentina and Brazil complicated relations, although Mancilla denied this fact.
I had no objection to Ayrton joining the team. I read his biography and said, great, he will be another person helping us.
So the four main characters were together, experienced in every way, firm and free, very ambitious young men. They spent the spring, summer and part of the fall on tracks similar to that abandoned air base in the English countryside, racing non-stop, and the drivers also had to try their hand at two circuit races, Brands Hatch and Silverstone. The team tested at Brands Hatch in February, with Ayrton driving the 80s car while his two teammates drove the late 81 model. Of course, Senna was unhappy. Ralph asked Toledano to tell to the Brazilian to do 3 or 4 laps to warm up the tires before going for a fast lap. Ayrton rolled his eyes as if to say, "You think I need to talk about this?" He left the pits, but soon returned to say that he crashed the car. He returned on foot holding the steering wheel in his hands. Herman seemed to explode and Toledano wondered if Senna had done it deliberately since he had inherited last year's car. And that was a sign. The first race, third on the day's program, took place at Brands Hatch. It consisted of 12 laps of a short lap circuit with a total length of 23 kilometers, 100 meters. A total of 28 drivers were entered into the race. Almost all of them are now completely forgotten. Senna was still driving the 1980 car, and on March 1st, at his first ever race at Brands Hatch, Harry qualified in the middle of the starting field and finished 5th behind both of his Van Diemen partners. He finished 6 seconds behind the winner Mancilla, and there were 3 important points in this. Firstly, he proved that he can ride the entire race. Secondly, he was fast enough not to overdo it. Thirdly, his fastest lap of 50 seconds and 8 tenths was only 1 tenth slower than Mancilla's, meaning he could drive the car quickly and safely. Of course, it was a sign. A week later, the event took place in West London, another former airbase with a rustic, unremarkable atmosphere. Senna finished 3rd. A week later, Ayrton received the 81 car for the Brands Hatch race, where something amazing happened. There were 2 qualifying races and the final. In the first qualifying round, he was only 8th, but it started to rain, and Ayrton told Toledano that he would like to increase the tire pressure. Alfonso went to Senna's mechanic to report this. The mechanic called it crazy. The pressure was 16 psi in the front tires and 80 in the rear.
Does he want to swim on water or what?
Toledano went to Ralph with an explanation, to which he replied,
This damn Brazilian will do what I say. I am in charge here.
to which Senna retorted,
I pay money and have the right to customize the car the way I want.
it was a sign. This way he got exactly the tires he wanted. He then explained his actions to Alfonso.
Imagine that my fingers are the tread on the tires.
He clenched his purse tightly.
This is the state at a pressure of 16 pounds.
He unclenched to his purse and relaxed his fingers.
At a pressure of 25 pounds, the tread pattern expands and allows water to pass through faster.
There was one very specific turn on the track, Paddock Hill Bend, which was on the descent and had an unblessed bend. In qualifying, Toledano noticed that in this corner Senna was moving to the outside of his usual line, which means that he was slower on the entrance to the corner but much faster on the exit. When Toledano asked why he went so wide, Senna replied that the normal trajectory in a corner is covered with a layer of rubber left by a large number of tires. And when the track is wet, this layer becomes like ice. But on the outside, the tires have grip on the asphalt because of the layer, there is no rubber there. It was a sign. The championship final also took place on a wet track. Mansell knocked out Senna, and it cost Ayrton 8 lost places. Toledano led while Senna battled with Englishman Andy Ackerley, who actually overtook him, but Ayrton was literally hanging on his rear wing. And Ackerley, slowing down, blocked him. He tried to close the gate, but Ayrton showed that he is an uncompromising opponent, saying that I will not retreat. The car stopped and Andy, damaging his car, left the track. A few laps later, Senna was already behind Mansell. They grappled and Senna again went onto the wet grass not far from the metal bump stop. Ayrton controlled the slide so that the car touched the bump stop only slightly.
He returned to the track like a tiger.
Toledano recalled. They were wheel-to-wheel when Senna overtook him by driving into the side of the corner and won the race, the first of his racing career. This hectic race lasted 15 minutes 7 seconds and 2/10, and Ayrton was ahead of Mansell by 9 seconds and 4/10, which in general was quite a lot. This was also a sign.
The race was held in the rain,
Recalls his mechanic Buddy Pellon.
and immediately after the start it became clear that Senna would have no equal today. And when he finally crossed the finish line first, his wife Lillian, distraught with happiness, rushed to me. This fragile girl was in such ecstasy that she almost tore me, a healthy man, off the ground. In general, she was very good and an excellent cook. I remember she baked simply delicious banana cakes according to some special Brazilian recipe and brought them to us in the boxes. Believe me, I have never tasted anything tastier in my life.
Lillian spoke English even worse than Senna, but she was a seductive girl that when she walked around the paddock, there wasn't a single guy who wouldn't stop to look at her.
Agrees with Buddy magazine photographer Kit Sutton, who began working as an Ayrton personal photojournalist precisely from that very rainy race.
In Thruxton, Senna himself approached me and offered to work for him. He needed photos from the races for the Brazilian press and to find sponsors.
It was a sign. Kit Sutton wasn't only Ayrton's personal photographer, but also his best friend. They often shared secrets that we, of course, won't know about. But I still suggest turning to his memories.
As fate would have it, I was there working for a Brazilian motorsport magazine that wanted photographs of Brazilian drivers racing in England. Otherwise, I would probably have paid him no attention at all. I was shy in those days, so I never introduced myself. I just took lots of photographs of him in the paddock, on the track, everywhere. He must have wondered why this photographer he had never seen. The following weekend I was at a loose end, so I took out a free British Rail promotion ticket I had been given and used it to travel to Brands Hatch Circuit, where Ayrton was racing. Recalling it now, I am certain that I only went because of the free ticket and for no other reason. It was pure fate and my life was destined for a change of course. When I arrived in the paddock, it was a normal Brands Hatch Sunday, with the sloping paddock packed with transporters and loads of hopeful young drivers. The chances of not seeing someone you knew were very high, but almost as soon as I set foot in the paddock, he was in front of me, out of nowhere, as if by magic. He instantly recognized me from Thruxton and came up to me. I have no idea if he had been planning to approach me or it was spontaneous. I never asked him. He had a reputation for being shy, but he just marched up and said,
"Are you a professional photographer?"
They were his first words. There was no hello or how are you, just straight down to business in his very poor English. Yes, of course, I replied.
"Well, I need photographs. Can you help me out?"
Yes, of course.
"I need the photographs to send to Brazil on a regular basis."
Yes, of course, I repeated for the third time. And that was it. From that day on for over 3 years, I was effectively his personal photographer. Although it seemed perfectly normal at the time, and in a few moments, an obscure Brazilian Formula 4 driver had acquired a personal photographer, a luxury even today's Formula 1 drivers do not have. I am not sure why I agreed, but he was special and I guess I sensed that. That day he went on to win his heat and win the race. It was very exciting and I was there on the podium to capture the moment. It was late evening, the light was fantastic and I took some memorable black and white photographs of him with his then wife Lillian. It was the start of my relationship with Ayrton. I carried on working with him and taking photographs. I effectively became his per man as well. I wrote his press releases and answered his fan mail for years. I suggested to him that we send photographs and press releases after each race to all the magazines around the world and the Formula 1 team managers such as Ron Dennis, Bernie Ecclestone and Quintero, letting them know about Ayrton's performances. Headed note paper was organised for him, with his helmet in full colour, and the bottom of the paper proudly stated, "For further information, contact Keith Sutton, 17 Ashfield Road, Cheadle, Cheshire." I wasn't a journalist or a writer, I just wanted to help him because I saw the talent and thought by helping him it would help me. I was only 9 months older than him and we both had the same ambitions, although in totally different directions. He wanted to be the best driver in Formula 1 and I wanted to be the best photographer.
Of course, they both ended up in Formula 1, where their paths diverged. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, but go back to 1981, because this year could have been the final one in the career of the young Ayrton Senna. With each race, Ayrton went faster and faster. But what was most striking was how accurately he assessed his capabilities even at such a young age. In addition, even then, Ayrton began to display those qualities that later delighted fans and irritated his detractors in Formula 1, an aggressive, sometimes explosive character. Senna went to Mallory Park and there he pursued Mansilla until the last lap, when, according to Ayrton, Enrique deliberately pushed him onto the grass. Mansilla subsequently insisted that he didn't do this. Senna returned to the track, finished the race second, and they reached the podium. After the ceremony, Ayrton fought Mansilla and grabbed him by the throat, who grabbed him back, and it took several people, including Ralph's wife Angie, to separate them. Yes, a fire burned in him, never extinguished in subsequent years. His approach to testing surprised even his personal mechanic.
One day after testing, he told me I could go to tenths faster here and gain another 3 in this corner. But I didn't do this, because today there are only tests. In qualifying, I would be 5 tenths faster.
Recalls Pelin.
And indeed, he drove exactly half a second faster. Surprisingly, he always knew exactly how much more he could add.
This accuracy and predictive ability will continue to amaze everyone who saw his race, including Grand Prix racing, where frankly few believed it until they saw it with their own eyes. At the next race, Senna was second again, finishing 1 second behind the talented Englishman Rick Morris. Ayrton then won at Walton Park in the north of England. Of the remaining 13 races in the 1981, he would win 10 and finish second in the remaining, with the exception of 4 plays at Brands Hatch in July. Furman says that around the middle of the season, his experience in auto racing gave him a single conclusion: one day, Senna will become a world champion.
Besides his amazing ability to control the car on a wet track, Ayrton always had a great start.
Continues Ralph Furman.
As soon as the traffic light turned green, he immediately gained a few meters. In addition, in the very first laps, while others were swinging, choosing their pace and warming up the tires, he showed the best laps and actually won the race. Already somewhere in the middle of the season, both Paddy and I knew for sure that we had a future world champion.
Morris experienced the Brazilian's explosive nature firsthand. At the race at Silverstone, Senna squeezed him with both wheels onto the grass on a downhill straight, which made Morris nervous. They entered the final chicane together and Morris passed him, although Senna was confident that he had closed all overtaking opportunities. Afterwards, Morris said,
Ayrton was unbearable. He came past the pits shaking his fist. He was shouting at Ralph Fairman.
But Ayrton couldn't lose. His feelings were so strong that they almost caused physical pain. Morris also recalls pre-race practice at Donington, where he gently and unintentionally interfered with Senna at the chicane.
I would hardly remember this incident, but in the paddock he flew into an indescribable rage. This showed his complete confidence in what he wanted. He was cold, calculating, and most of the time you could see his soft smile until someone disturbed him, and then his whole temperament was revealed.
Morris felt that while he was friends with Mansell and Toledano, Ayrton wasn't a friend to either of them. Morris believes that in racing at the junior level, friendship could overcome innate competition. But he himself perceived racing as a serious hobby and never intended to make a career out of it. And here he missed 2 points. Firstly, Senna was only interested in victory. Secondly, when he looked around, he saw everywhere only competitors who could stop him. And Senna's biggest enemies were his teammates, because they had the same technology at their disposal. In this particular case, it was Mansell and Toledano. Perhaps this position in itself was a sign. Morris saw Senna's level of skill during the race at Donington when behind him Ayrton began to fan one of the corners, lap after lap. This was unusual as one of the hardest things about the Ford formula is driving the car consistently. These cars are very nervous. Journalist Marcus P. says,
I have been closely watching the Ford 1600 formula since late 1907 Tyree until now. It is not every year that a world-class driver emerges from the 1600 series. But this is where the real international competition takes place. Because at that time in England, the Ford formula was for all young people exactly the place where they could come and race. That's why everyone moved to England and started racing. But Ayrton was absolutely outstanding.
From the first races in the Formula Ford, one could understand that it had become a new standard. It's not always easy to transition from karting to auto racing, but there is one more thing about it. Ayrton lived as if in a cocoon. He hasn't a big party animal, and besides, at that time he didn't speak English particularly well, so the only way for him to communicate with the outside world was his ability to drive a car, which is what he did.
How do I evaluate Senna's performance in nature? Compared to the others I've seen, it's like any comparison. You can't compare Fangio to Schumacher because they never raced against each other. But I will say that Senna was probably the most gifted guy we've seen racing. I don't think anyone could beat him. He was inimitable, taking off quickly from the start on cold tires. He was able to set the same time lap after lap, whether the tires were cold or not. The most amazing sight I saw was once in Thruxton. Keep in mind that on those old treaded tires the cars used to yaw and jump over the bumps, of which there were plenty in Thruxton. So, most of the time you just couldn't steer the car in a straight line. And although I can't remember the exact circumstances, the interesting thing was that Senna drove 3 laps in a row with exactly the same time, to within 1/100th of a second, and then drove another 3 awful circles that were within 1/10. It was incredibly stable, despite the fact that these cars want to throw you off the track at the first opportunity. They didn't have much power, but they also didn't have much grip. To be so smooth, so precise, he had to drive the car along exactly the same path, deviating by millimeters where everyone else was fighting for inches. It was amazing, and that is what made it stand out. He was one with the car.
This makes Senna's consistent success even more remarkable. On the last day of August, Ayrton, who had won the REC championship 3 weeks earlier with his 12th victory of the season, also won the 2014 championship one stage before the end. He only raced one race at P&O. He became the first Brazilian to win two British Formula 4 championships in one season.
Once in Snetterton, I watched the F1600 race.
Recalls Van Diemen Formula 2000 team manager Danny Russian.
Senna was in the lead. He was only a few yards ahead of his pursuers. But then it started to rain, and on the next lap he was already ahead of the others. By half a lap. Oh my God! I said to myself and immediately went to meet him. I suggested that he switch to the F2000 next year, promising the full package European and British championships for only £10,000, mere pennies compared to what other drivers were paying.
After the awards ceremony, circuit announcer Brian Jones approached Senna with a microphone.
Well, Ayrton, you performed brilliantly in the F1600. Now is the road up to Formula 3 waiting for you?
No, I'm quitting racing and returning to Brazil.
Ayrton himself was incredibly upset by this turn of events. But what could he do? His father, who financed him this whole season, refused to give him money for the next one and demanded that he return to Brazil, finally come to his senses and graduate from university. Senna had no savings of his own, and there were no money to continue living in England, much less compete in racing. It didn't matter responsibly in Brazil in those years. A huge economic crisis broke out in Latin America. The exchange rate of the Bolivian peso fell more than 1,000 times in just 1 year. And in Brazil itself, the rich didn't even cry but sobbed. The country was bogged down in 100 billion debts. What can we talk about auto racing? Before returning to Sao Paulo, he flew to Italy, where he took part in the World Karting Championship held in Parma, finishing 4th.
The card I received was useless. Sad.
And Ayrton returned home.
From October to February, I carefully helped my father in his business, but all these months I dreamed of England and dreamed of returning to racing.
Senna later recalled, either Ayrton finally managed to convince his father, or Milton de Silva was simply tired of seeing the constant sadness in his son's eyes, but after 5 months he finally gave in and gave Ayrton the opportunity to decide his own fate, and he naturally immediately chose racing. Then there was a small family council at which the parents blessed the Brazilian for his exploits.
I just managed to convince them that too much money had already been invested in my racing, and I could only get it back by getting into Formula 1.
Ayrton later joked. He immediately called Ralph Furman and asked about his opportunities. The Van Diemen team also built a Ford 2000 Formula car. Both Furman and Russian, having launched the project, began to discuss who should take the wheel. After Senna returned to Sao Paulo, Ralph kept in touch with him by telephone. So they quickly came to an agreement on who should get place in Formula 2000. The person they agreed on agreed. Ayrton couldn't resist the temptation to race. And a few days later, Ayrton was already flying across the ocean again, towards his future victories. Senna flew back to London at almost the same time as the year before. His determination was almost frightening. Once the decision was made that he would pursue a career as a racing driver, every waking hour his entire mind was completely focused on proving the correctness of the decision. And this added even more passion to victories. This time he came to England alone, without Lillian. Shortly before his return to Europe, they broke up.
She was from a very good family, accustomed to comfort and servants, and was absolutely unprepared for the role of a housewife in our house in Norfolk.
Senna admitted bitterly after the divorce.
This marriage was a mistake.
Senna signed.
But she was a very good cook.
A few years later, Ayrton will say that he simply couldn't combine racing with marriage. A love affair is another matter. Ayrton gave Lillian a bouquet of yellow flowers as a farewell gift. In fact, the contract that Ayrton would soon sign simply couldn't support his profession and family life at the same time, and he chose racing. So, the active support of his family certainly gave him peace of mind and must have taken a lot of pressure off him. Returning to East England, Senna met Furman and Russian. Ayrton immediately recorded that Russian offered him participation in the championship for £10,000 and that he was ready to accept this offer. Ralph, who knew nothing about this but knew very well how insignificant the sum of £10,000 for a season, insisted on a higher price, but Senna didn't yield. And then he couldn't go back on his words. By the way, this wasn't a shock. It came a little later. After a brilliant victory in Formula Ford 1600, many paths opened up for Ayrton. He was invited by Formula 1 2000, Formula 3 and even Formula 2 teams.
The invitation to Formula 2, of course, flattered my pride. But factory teams race there, and a lot depends on the car and the engine. If you don't hit the mark, you can ruin your entire career. Formula 3 is a more tempting option. The cars there are approximately equal. But in order to succeed in 3 ruble, you need to first put in a lot of kilometers on tests, and I don't have time for that. Ford 2000 remains.
Upon arrival at the team's factory, Senna was dressed in one of the dirty old overalls, which he had borrowed from Chico Serra, since he hadn't yet bought a new one after his decision to retire. Russian partner Robert Green hadn't met Ayrton before, so when he saw him in dirty overalls, Green thought,
"Damn, what a guy. He doesn't even have his own overalls."
Formula 2000 cars, unlike Formula Ford 1600, have a wing, which makes them completely different, because when their angle of inclination changes, the behavior of the car changes. Russian prepared to train Senna to use the wings, not knowing how long it might take or how difficult it will be. So he built a lesson round showing Ayrton all the possible options for how the wings worked. Senna drove for about 30 laps, studying the various options and their effect on the car, then go out and calmly declared that he understood how they worked. Third, the Russian had the opportunity to make sure that Senna wasn't bragging, he was simply stating a fact. He really understood how wings work. Then he soon learned how sensitive Ayrton was to the operation of the car. During tests, he would come into the pits and say that one tire needed to be added 2 pounds of pressure. When Russian decided to check if this was true, it turned out that this was indeed the case. Whenever something like this happens, then he felt a strong sense of disbelief, because if Senna could talk about a car with such a degree of accuracy, then what was he even capable of? He could drive at his own record pace for 4 or 5 laps, then stop and start talking for hours about how the left rear tire behaved in this corner and in that corner, which was simply incredible. That was a shock. Senna had nowhere to live, so he found fellow Brazilian Mauricio Cucumintna, who was competing in Formula Ford 1600 that year as Senna's replacement at the Works Mandemon team. Cucumintna was living with his wife Stella at a house in Eton, Norwich, where they paid £160 a month in rent, and was more than happy to lodge his friend. Stella was more tolerant of racing than Senna's wife Lillian had been. Visitors to the house remember a happy atmosphere. Within a year, Ayrton had to fight in 2 British and European championships. His teammate was Kenny Andrews. He finished the first 6 races of the British Championship with a 100% result. 6 wins, 6 pole positions and 6 fastest laps. Senna's mechanic at the time, Sweet Peter Dahl, said later.
He had 3 goals for every race: take pole position, set fastest lap and win. Anything less was failure.
Particularly remarkable was his victory on April 9 at Snetterton. Ayrton, as usual, took the lead from the start, but then a collapse occurred behind him. During the lap, the judges didn't have time to completely clear the track from gravel and debris. Senna had to drive straight over them, after which he suddenly slowed down and rolled back about 20 seconds. The race was led by Senna's RGR partner Kenny Andrews.
I beat Senna by 15 seconds. I could barely see him in the mirrors and was already beginning to believe in victory.
Recalls Ken.
But he soon caught up and passed me.
It was only after the race that Russian Andrews learned what Senna's victory actually cost. When he hit some debris early in the race, one of them damaged his front brakes, and his car only had rear brakes for the rest of the race. That's why he lost 20 seconds at the beginning while he got used to the new features of his car. But then, even with the crippled car, he managed to win the race. The following weekend, Senna took part in the first round of the EFDA Formula 4 2000 Euro Series at Zolder in Belgium. There were new European drivers to compete against, but he was still the favorite. His reputation had spread, and his fellow competitors were eyeing him nervously. They were doubtless even more nervous when he took pole position by a second. But this time it wasn't to be. His Ford engine let go on the third lap before he had even had a chance to set his customary fastest lap, and the race victory went to Dutchman Cor User. It was the first time Senna had lost that season. All the same, the offers were flooding in from people who had recognized his talent, although he refused them all, even ex-Daytona 24-hour winner Tony Hatsmith, who offered him £50,000 for the chance to promote him. He put his Euro Series record straight on the familiar territory of Donington 2 weeks later. It was pole position, fastest lap, and victory once again. The following day, he was at Mallory Park for the next round of the British Championship. He lost out on pole position for the first time that year and had to settle for second, but still took fastest lap and victory. The next race on 9 May was another Euro Series round at Zolder. The support race was the 1982 Belgian Grand Prix. It was a turning point for Senna and for Formula 1. It was the weekend that Gilles Villeneuve was killed. Villeneuve loved to take risks, and people who knew him well say he loved it. Over time, people will compare Senna to Villeneuve, saying that Ayrton didn't understand the risk because he had never been present at a race where there was a fatality. But, of course, he understood everything, because by claiming the opposite, people forget about Zolder. Without a doubt, Senna realized the danger of what he was doing. Once, at a press conference, he stated,
"Only an idiot can engage in auto racing and not understand the full extent of the risk. Do you think I am an idiot?"
Villeneuve flew into Zolder in his own helicopter from his home in the south of France, and Russia remembers driving past the airstrip with Senna as they left the track after the tragic race. The helicopter stood motionless there, as the final destination. However, another significant event occurred in Zolder. The biggest star in Brazil at the time was reigning world champion Nelson Piquet. Russian recalls,
Ayrton said to me, "I am going to introduce myself to Nelson Piquet because I want to be like him. He was so excited, just like a boy. And all I could say was, yeah, okay, but Piquet snubbed him and he took it personally. You do at that age. He was very angry and said, I am going to beat him one day."
And another time, he thoughtfully asked Dennis,
"Who do you think is the better driver, me, Chico Serra, or Nelson Piquet?"
"Well, I don't know."
Russian hesitated, and Ayrton answered himself,
"You know, I have a huge advantage over both of them because I've been karting since I was 4 years old."
At 22, he had actually been karting for 18 years. Thus began a feud that would only develop further as Piquet spoke less than kindly of Senna in subsequent years. Was it because Rio Piquet's hometown was opposite to Sao Paulo, or because the older generation driver didn't want to recognize the youth? Or maybe it was a natural confrontation between two athletes of the same nationality. Or maybe everything is much simpler and they just didn't like each other. Or maybe all at once. Ayrton was so angry with Nelson that the only solution was to stage a show on the track on a day when motorsport was mourning the loss of Gilles Villeneuve. And the show went on until Senna spun and was forced to leave the race. For Dennis Russian, the crash had the same cause as another famous one 6 years later, when he crashed alone just a few laps from a glorious victory at the Monaco Grand Prix.
Ayrton just couldn't get his leg off. If he did, he would lose concentration and crash.
And because Senna never entertained the possibility of a roar, Dennis didn't forget that the day was the only moment in all the races of 1982 when he saw Ayrton admit his mistake. Walking past the penalty area on his way back from the round, Senna came across Dennis and, without slowing down, uttered 4 words almost insistently.
I am really sorry.
Russian recalls.
He lost concentration and just fell off the track. He was so far in the lead. It's strange because he did exactly the same thing at Monaco in Formula 1 in 1988. He did it on a number of occasions. I never did figure it out. I think maybe the reason he went off at Zolder was because he was distracted by everything. He had the offers from Toleman and McLaren that weekend and I don't know if it went to his head. Then there was the Piquet thing. Also, he had met a girl. He wanted to go and meet her somewhere that evening, but I had the only car. I told him if he won, he could have the car and I'd make my own way back to the hotel. But if he lost, he'd have to drive me all the way back. Of course, when he lost, I made him keep to the deal and he sulked all the way home.
Zolder wasn't just talking about Villeneuve's death. His disappointment with Nelson Piquet and the frustration of riding alone to lead the race. That weekend, Ayrton introduced himself to the journalist who would become one of his best friends and who remembers his first meeting as a thin, ugly, big-eared but determined child. Surprisingly, even in Brazil, Senna constantly dreamed of England. Now in Europe, he missed his homeland terribly, especially in spring and autumn. The heat-loving Brazilian couldn't fully adapt to the cold climate of foggy Albion. He never got into the car without first warming up his gloves and balaclava on the radiator. And he had an early test because he couldn't bring himself to get out of warm bed on a cold morning. Sometimes he simply hated England with its eternal fogs and dreamed of the hot sun of Brazil. But there was nowhere to go because only through the sieve of English racing could he get into Formula 1. And every day he came closer to his dream step by step. Back at the end of the March, on the advice of Sutton, his photographer and part-time PR manager, Senna sent out small press releases about himself to F1 team managers, and soon the first responses began to arrive. Ron Dennis, Frank Williams, Bernie Ecclestone and Alex Hockridge became seriously interested in Ayrton. The latter even invited the Brazilian to drive at Toleman next spring. But Senna was in no hurry. He didn't yet feel ready to make his debut in Formula 1. In addition, he wasn't tempted to start his career in the Middleton team, which Toleman was.
I didn't want to just become another F1 driver. I wanted to be a winner, and I hoped to get a car that would allow me to win races.
However, now Ayrton had another dream, to beat Nelson Piquet in Formula 1. At the time, Ron Dennis had his eye on the newcomer and was ready to make a serious offer, but Ayrton refused him too. Ron was furious.
You will not believe. I offered him everything I agreed on, but I don't care. If this son kneels in the future, I will never offer him another job. He wanted a 100 guarantee that McLaren could win the championship in 1984. I have never seen so much arrogance in a newbie in my entire life. We had a big fight and didn't make a deal. He wanted options and I couldn't guarantee that our car would be a champion once he started racing for us.
Senna later recalled why he turned down the offer from his future mentor Ron Dennis.
Ron Dennis was not the first Formula One manager to offer me an opportunity in Formula One. He offered me a Formula 3 program, a test contract in Formula One, good money and nothing to worry about. There was the possibility of a full-time Formula One place with McLaren in 1984, but I was not sure, did not know Ron. I had read a lot about Formula One and talked to a lot of people, but I was a bit worried about it. I preferred to organize my own Formula 3 program and go from there. I did not turn down Ron. I told him that I preferred to make the choice of Formula 3 team myself. I felt that I was in a better position to choose than he was because I knew the people involved. He did not understand that, but it is the reason I did not go with him, and I still believe that decision was correct at the time.
Senna's next race was the British round in Outland Park on May 30. It was his worst to date. He missed pole, he missed fastest lap and retired with a puncture. Although he did win the Celebrity Challenge in a Sunbeam Talbot later that afternoon. In the next 4 rounds of the series, he seemed to have lost his qualifying sparkle. Although he brought home 4 fastest laps and 4 victories to make the championship all by this. In between Brands Hatch and Outland, he went to Hockenheim for the next round of year series. He qualified on pole, but had a bad start and was caught up in the first corner pile-up initiated by leader Core User. At this stage of the season, Senna had won 12 times in 16 races. He had only lost 1 round of the British Championship and had a commanding lead in the title chase. On the plane out to the Dutch Grand Prix support race in Zandvoort on 3rd July, Senna was set next to none other than Frank Williams. It was the first time that the pair had met. Senna took the opportunity to introduce himself and tell Williams about his career. He stuck in the team owner's memory enough for him to receive his very first Formula One test for Williams a year later. His list of Formula One team contacts was growing. Fellow Brazilian and double world champion Emerson Fittipaldi couldn't offer him much from his struggling Formula One outfit, but was pleased to introduce him to all the team managers. He had also just done a test with fledgling Formula 3 team Jordan. The Jordan test at Silverstone in late June was Senna's first outing in a Formula 3 car. Eddie Jordan had been pressing out by the Brazilian's talent to give him the test for free. Senna completed 20 laps, came back to the pits to make some adjustments, went out again and within another 10 laps had beaten the pole time set by the previous weekend by Jordan driver James Weaver. And yet, this season was the last for Senna, the karting driver. After another failure at the World Championship in Kalmar, Sweden, where his tire burst, Ayrton ended his karting career. However, the Swedish failure that season turned out to be only an unpleasant exception for Senna. In general, the Brazilian finished 1982 even better than the previous one, having won 21 victories in 27 races, Ayrton above the British and European Formula 4 2000 championships. So Senna left his glorious Formula 4 career behind under a cloud. He returned to Brazil for a holiday, and when he arrived back in England, it was to compete in the televised non-championship Formula 3 race at Truxton in mid-November with West Series Racing.
This race was very important for me.
Senna recalled.
Formula 3 was then shown on British television, and if the result was favourable, it could greatly help me raise the budget for the next season.
The result of the first race exceeded even the most optimistic forecast. Pole position, fastest lap in the race, leading from start to finish, victory. This was Ayrton's debut in British Formula 3, his last step on the road to Formula 1. But he didn't forget his friend and mentor Danish Russian, though, and the pair remained close throughout Senna's career. Russian loves to reminisce about Senna. He remembers.
He was always a very, very good friend. I continued to help him when he went on to Formula 3 with Dick Bennett's at West Surrey. The last time I saw him was when he was testing for Williams in Portugal in 1994. He was different. His heart didn't seem to be in it anymore. The time I saw him before that was in Brazil, where he told me that he wanted to drive for Ferrari. I still miss him.
That was a long time in the future. At the end of 1982, Senna was still looking for his first Formula 1 drive. Also, his dominant Formula 4 performances had drawn a lot of attention from the right circles. In his first 2 seasons of car racing, he had 4 championships and had taken 34 wins from 47 Formula 4 races. It was a phenomenal achievement. In 1983, Senna signed a contract with West Surrey Racing, one of the strongest British Formula 3 teams, and began the new season in his usual role as the main favorite. However, here for the first time in 3 years in England he encountered serious resistance. The man who was able to compete on an equal footing with the young Brazilian wizard was the future F1 driver and world champion in sports prototype racing, Englishman Martin Brundle, who was then racing for Eddie Jordan's F3 team. The background of this confrontation was further aggravated by the fact that Jordan became the first to put Senna in completely free in a F3 car a year ago, but after Ayrton chose West Surrey Racing, he harbored a grudge against the Brazilian and only dreamed of not let him win the title. Senna didn't test for Jordan again and never discussed a race drive with Eddie Jordan, despite the team principal's continual attempts to reach him by telephone. He had already made up his mind that Dick Bennett's West Surrey Racing was a pedigree team in Formula 3 and he wanted to be with the best. Unlike Jordan, West Surrey Racing was a team with a pedigree. Bennett came to England from New Zealand in 1972 and soon gained experience engineering in Formula Atlantic and Formula 5000. In the mid-70s, he worked for March Engineering Formula 2 team. In 1978, Bennett moved on to run Danish Project 4 racing operation, working at its factory as the team entered cars in various championships. In 1980, he joined Project 4 Formula 3 team, and Stefan Johansson won the championship that year under Bennett's guidance. Bennett joined forces with Mike Cox of West Surrey Engineering in 1981 to run Jonathan Palmer in British Formula 3, and he won the championship. As Mike Cox struggled for cash, West Surrey Racing was born as a separate organization, and in 1982 Bennett entered Enrique Mansilla in the British Formula 3 Championship. He won 5 races and lost the championship to Tommy Byrne by just 3 points. But what impressed Senna was the team's reliability record. Bennett hadn't had a single car failure in 1982. Back in Brazil, Senna's confidence about sponsorship wasn't misplaced. He needed over £110,000 for a season of Formula 3, serious money after the chicken feed days of Formula 4, which had cost his father a total of £40,000 for 2 seasons. He negotiated new deals with Brazilian bank Banerjee and the Brazilian pool clothing company, which had given him limited support for Formula 4 2000. With his father chipping in another £10,000, Senna had about £70,000. It wasn't enough, but Bennett found the balance from the Valvoline oil company, anxious to be on the championship-winning car. Before the start of the season, Ayrton also made a momentous decision. He dropped the Da Silva bit of his name and restored to just using mother's maiden name, Senna. Da Silva wasn't distinctive and a common name in Brazil. It was the equivalent of Smith in Britain. The championships seemed to have started in a better way for Senna, and all the victories were now much more difficult for him than in Formula 4. Ayrton continued to win one race after another. Although he was dominating in Formula 3 championship, he had a big problem looming. 23-year-old Martin Brundle was clearly the best of the race, and for every first place Senna was getting, Brundle was taking second in Eddie Jordan's car. Coming up to the halfway mark of the season, Senna had 88 points to Brundle's 54. Brundle had finished second in 8 of the races and third in the others. He was clearly Senna's only opposition, if he could have been said to have any opposition. So one day at Silverstone, Senna managed to overtake Brundle twice at Stowe, and then in Beckett, along the outside trajectory.
That was incredible. He was already to wheels on the grass, but stubbornly rushed forward.
Martin recalls the fight with Senna at Beckett. Brundle's bosses Eddie Jordan described this early season as a group of drivers trying to find themselves while being demoralized by Senna. And it was completely true. Ayrton loved to be in control and to be the best in everything, even if it didn't involve racing. Back in the days of Formula 4 2000, all young racers loved to go to a cafe to drink something warm, have a snack and play video game. Ayrton of course walked with them, but stayed away, because thought that he was simply not interested in games. But one day he decided to play it and immediately completed it in its entirety. As it turned out, Ayrton spent the entire afternoon playing this game, trying first to reach the level at which all the riders stopped, and then to completely complete it. So Eddie Jordan, showman, salesman, motivator, amateur psychologist, and proud owner of the Irish talent for talking, took on Brundle's speed.
The idea was that we work him so hard that he would eventually believe he was as good as Senna. Senna's poor strategy was extremely simple. He took pole, drove the first few laps very quickly, and broke all resistance. The other riders couldn't handle it. If you couldn't keep up with him, you immediately lost, because you could never catch up with him again.
In the end, Martin Brundle had to admit that if you keep Senna's rhythm, he will sooner or later take to the top. He already realized that everything is decided in the first turn. Senna was very aggressive. He took imaginable and unimaginable risks in order to break away from his pursuers in the initial 2 laps, among whom Martin Brundle was often included. In turn, Senna admitted that Brundle had become a more aggressive driver throughout the season. But in the first 9 races, Ayrton broke the record of Beco, who won 8 victories in a row in '78. But then a streak of failures followed. Moreover, as later in Formula 1, Ayrton was let down by his excessive focus on winning. For Senna, there were no other places other than the first, and in his quest for victory, he often crossed the line of reasonable risk. The 10th round on 11 June was the biggest race of the year to date. Silverstone was hosting a combined round of the European and British Formula 3 championships, and top-class continental opposition would be present. This means that some of the continent's leading young riders will take part, including one Gerhard Berger. According to technical regulations, the British Championship was held on Avon tires, and the European Championship on Yokohama. This means that any driver in the British Championship who installed Yokohama tires was included in the European Championship standings and couldn't count on results in the British Championship. Senna chose Japanese tires. Brundle, on the contrary, initially decided that since Ayrton's result wouldn't count towards the British Championship, he had a good chance to close the gap in points. The first qualifying session was bad, but the track had dried out in time for the second, and Senna had soon set the fastest time. Brundle was languishing in 12th, although he was still by far the fastest of the British runners. It wasn't, however, where he wanted to be. He wanted to win. In the second qualifying, Brundle made a spontaneous decision to switch to Yokohama. He put the car on pole less than a tenth of a second ahead of Senna. In an attempt to find a set of tires that would suit him until the end of the race, Senna installed 3 different types, and after the second lap he noticed that the left rear wasn't working at all.
If I want to overtake someone, then while I am behind him, I will carefully study where I am faster. If I see that my car is faster, much faster, in one of the corners, I will try to overtake. There are no corners in which it is impossible to overtake. You just need to decide where to do it.
At the start, Brundle had the best getaway and Senna struggled to catch him. Against the advice of the Yokohama engineers, he had chosen to run 3 different components of tire all at once. And now he was paying the price, facing massive understeer. He soon found that he was struggling to hold off regular European runner Johnny Dumfries for second. Senna was determined to catch Brundle and put Dumfries onto the grass rather than let him pass. But on the 7th lap he pushed too far and crashed at the Woodcote chicane. Brundle won the race, but because he had been entered for the European Championship, the gap to Senna in the British Championship remained unchanged. It could easily have been all over right then. Brundle could have had his moment of glory and that would have been that. But Senna had been defeated, and it means that next time he would have to push himself a little bit harder to make sure that there was no recurrence. During the next stage of qualifying, Ayrton crashed into the judges' box and ultimately didn't participate in the race. The accident that left Ayrton without a car was just one of the most treacherous of the season. In the middle of the race, while flying a lap, trying to improve on the pole position he had already won, he entered the corner at the end of the hill called Mountain, located behind the paddock, so fast that his route simply took off, landing hard on the race control station, running over one of the marshals and breaking his legs. Brundle won, and at the next stage, in duel with Brundle, he crashed into the fence. Brundle won again, and suddenly the situation on points became Senna 89, Brundle 73.
I told him that it was impossible to win every race and that sometimes it was better to settle for second place than not get any points at all. But it was all in vain,
complained Dick Bennett. As a result, Senna finished second only twice during the season, but in 6 races he was unable to reach the finish line at all. The next race was at Silverstone and another big one. The British Grand Prix supporting race on 16 July was the showpiece of the season. All the Formula One team bosses would be there on the lookout for new talent. Senna couldn't report another silly mistake, and he didn't make one. In qualifying, the Brazilian won pole position, beating his main rival in the championship Martin Brundle by only 0.04 seconds. And on Sunday, despite a bad start, he won the race and attracted the attention of Frank Williams. At that time, Williams had 2 experienced drivers racing. The current world champion finished with Keke Rosberg and Jacques Lafitte, who had just arrived from Ligier. But Iron Frank was looking to the future and was looking for a young, talented driver, like Ayrton. The next stage took place in Donington on July 24. Senna got pole and fastest lap, but Brundle was quicker off the line and won the race. The lead was back to down 80 points. A few days later, at the Williams test at Donington Park, driving a Keke Rosberg tuned Williams FW08C, Ayrton Senna's Formula One career began. As Frank Williams explained, at that time it was a mutual offer, since in the future Ayrton will remember that they were the first to give him this opportunity.
After just a few laps, it became clear that he was very talented.
Williams later recalled.
On the 20th lap, he showed a time almost a second faster than Jonathan Palmer.
who was working at Test Drive Williams at that time.
And a second is a large gap on a lap that can be completed in a minute.
At that time, they used a ring without the Melbourne hairpin loops, only 3.1 km long. Senna was so fast that Williams, without saying a word to Ayrton, ordered his mechanics to add another 20 gallons of fuel so that the extra weight would slow him down, so that his value on the Grand Prix driver market could be lowered.
Senna was very good, but when I returned to the factory, I never said to Patrick Head, "We will take this guy, whatever happens." Perhaps this was my mistake.
He had to wait 11 long years to get Ayrton, and when he finally succeeded, he had to pay a lot for it. The championship was drawn to a close end for the first time this season. Ayrton wasn't its leader. There was only one race left. Renault had 123 points to Senna 122 and was the man of the moment. However, Dick Bennis had a trick up his sleeve. He had discovered a very important piece of information that would put West Surrey Racing now back on the pair with the Jordan run cars. He recalls,
I possibly didn't get on the case quick enough. We both had Toyota engines, both built by the Nova Motor Company in Italy, but Martin's were being rebuilt in Italy and ours were being rebuilt in England. And ours didn't get the evolution. The chassis was good, but we were losing it in straight line speed. That meant we were running less downforce at the wing, so we had to fight harder through the corners. That's why accidents happened, and Ayrton was getting frustrated because he knew he was as good as he had been before, but Martin was challenging him. We were a bit slow on the uptake. Before the final round, we sent our engine back to Nova Motor in Italy as well. Ayrton drove out to Italy with it and spent 3 or 4 days with Mr. Pedrazzani, the boss of Nova Motor. Plus, Ralt had 2 chassis modifications, and there was one for us and one for Eddie Jordan. Ron Torenic was being fair.
one of the best innovations of the weekend had been Senna's decision to tape up the oil radiator outlet to enable the engine to heat up more quickly and allow him to run faster in the crucial opening laps. The problem was that by 6th lap his engine had begun to overheat. Senna, however, had thought of this. He couldn't reach the tape from the cockpit wearing his seatbelts, so he had practiced unfastening his seatbelts and reaching out of the car on the straight to remove the tape. Just behind him, Bradle saw the Brazilian reach out of the car and almost lost it at the chicane. But once his seatbelts had been rebuckled, he began to pull away again until he crossed the line 7 seconds ahead. Senna was champion, but that wasn't the end of his Formula 3 career. At the same time, Ferrari also thought about Ayrton. Mauro Fornieri was already familiar with Senna in absentia, when he, while still competing in Formula 4, was spinning in the Ferrari pits. It was Thursday, July 1st, 1982. Ayrton watched the times of Didier Pironi and Patrick Temp, was worried and approached the pit wall. Seeing him, engineer Mauro Fornieri was quite surprised, and with a wave of his hand, he called Pietro Cardini, the chief mechanic of Ferrari, to his side.
Sorry, but who is this? Walks back and forth in our boxes, chats with you.
This is Ayrton da Silva, a Brazilian, who raced in Italy on a kart and came here to participate in Formula Ford, my friend.
Fornieri suddenly waved, saying, "Okay, no problem."
The free practice was over. Cardini introduced him to me. We chatted. The guy spoke excellent Italian.
2 days later, there was a Formula Ford race, and da Silva won in front of all the Formula 1 executives, among whom was, yes, Mauro Fornieri. He, along with Cardini, watched Ayrton from the Ferrari pits. Later, Ayrton asked to celebrate the victory in the Ferrari pits, bringing a bottle and plastic cups to drink with the mechanics, who had given him shelter the day before, and with whom he had become friends. And so, John Hogan, then the chief executive of Philip Morris, responsible for the largest and the most important sponsorship in the history of Formula One, Marlboro cigarettes, was also impressed. Ferrari was looking for a driver to replace René Arnoux, which they didn't know about yet. Hogan, who had been introduced to Senna the year before during the Austrian Grand Prix, then suggested to Ferrari director Marco Pecchini that he hire Ayrton immediately for the 1984 season. Pecchini's response was later seen as a big mistake due to the countless bosses he had to say briefly.
No, he is too young.
Pecchini's feared for the Brazilian's explosive nature, as well as his uncompromising and risky behavior on the track. However, Bernie Ecclestone himself became seriously interested in the young talent. Nelson Piquet had just won his second world championship, and his position in Bernie's team was unshakable. But to replace Patrese, who left for Alfa Romeo, the team's title sponsor, the dairy concern Parmalat, demanded to invite an Italian driver. However, for the test at Le Castle, where Piquet tested the Brabham BT52B, Ecclestone called not only two drivers from the Apennines, Mario Baldi and Pierluigi Martini, but also two Latin Americans, Colombian Roberto Guerra and Ayrton Senna.
I became interested in Ayrton because I had heard that he was a very fast driver, and I only met him for the first time at the end of 1983. This was after his tests for Williams at Donington, but before tests for McLaren and Toleman at Silverstone. We gave him the opportunity to test the champion Brabham on the Paul Ricard circuit.
This time showed the same test result as Baldi and lost exactly 2 seconds to Nelson Piquet. Bernie wanted to sign a contract with Senna. Ayrton naturally was also not against starting his career as a Grand Prix driver in the champion's stable. Ecclestone most likely would have been able to persuade Parmalat to take another Brazilian to the team. But then Piquet intervened. Nelson wasn't going to share the glory of the best driver with anyone Brazilian now, and never wanted to race in the same team with Senna. Piquet didn't hesitate to trip up Ayrton. Bernie remembers further.
From there we returned to London together on my plane. The next day he had to fly to Macau for the Formula 3 race. He immediately impressed me with the fact that he knew exactly what he was capable of and was very self-confident. And he impressed me as an extremely pleasant person. We even almost agreed to sign a contract. But the problem was Nelson Piquet, who was then driving for Brabham. He disparagingly called Ayrton a taxi driver, although Senna's potential was obvious to everyone. Moreover, Nelson's bias against Senna, on the contrary, convinced me even more that Ayrton is very good. But the last word went to our title sponsor Parmalat, who supports Piquet. They said that instead of the second Brazilian in the team, they would prefer an Italian.
Senna flew to the Portuguese colony of Macau, where the first international Formula 3 race, later sometimes called the Formula 3 World Championship, was held. He arrived only the night before the start of the races and ended up going to the first qualifying session tired from the flight. The situation was further complicated by the fact that it was supposed to be a street race. He had never competed on a city tracks, had never encountered the special requirements for precision, and of course had never seen this track. On Friday, in second qualifying, he struggled with a damaged gear selector and could only complete another 3 laps. Struggling with jet lag and sleep, Senna still won a brilliant victory in the Macau Grand Prix. He was champion, and that night he celebrated with the team at the Lisboa Hotel until the early hours of the morning. It was the perfect end to a glorious Formula 3 career. A few months later, Williams' mistake was repeated by Dennis. After Ayrton's victory at Macau Free Grand Prix, McLaren invited him to test at Silverstone. Along with Senna, Ron brought 2 rising stars of world motorsport to Northamptonshire, Martin Brundle and Stefan Bellow. On McLaren's part, everything was done very professionally, with special attention to detail. They even had specially printed name stickers on the car so that when young drivers get into it, it looks like theirs. At that moment, John Watson, a McLaren racing driver, met Senna for the first time. Watson went out on the track and showed a time that became a benchmark for judging young people, after which he left. Brandon recalls that Senna completed 2 full sessions while he and Below only had 1. Having driven a McLaren for the first time, the Brazilian easily outperformed his young classmates. Moreover, Senna showed an even better time than 2-time world champion Niki Lauda in qualifying before the British Grand Prix.
Senna's second attempt ended in smoke, but he did not take his foot off the gas pedal to drive past Ron Dennis. I remember well,
said Brundle. Because he was standing next to Ron when it happened, Senna parked the smoking car, climbed out of the cockpit, jumped over the fence and asked Ron Dennis what time he had shown. To which Ron Dennis replied,
You know, it's really hard to time the stopwatch when there's blue smoke coming out of the back of my car and the driver isn't stopping.
Senna was fast, but this in fact didn't matter at all, because by the time Ron Dennis had already taken 2-time vice world champion Alan Prost from Renault to pair with Lauda and wasn't going to break the contract with the Frenchman for the sake of a fast but inexperienced Brazilian debutant. If in the famous team Senna wasn't welcomed, then at Toleman, Ayrton was welcomed with open arms. Ted Toleman and Alex Hockridge were just looking for a replacement for Derek Warwick, who had left for Renault, and the fast Brazilian turned up at just the right time. Alex Hockridge gave Senna a test drive at Silverstone in 1.5-liter turbocharged Toleman TG 183B, a chunky, angular car designed by Roy Burney. At first, Toleman chose between Senna and Brundle, but made up his mind after the first test at Silverstone. When he arrived for the test on Wednesday, 9 November, Senna was surprised by a skepticism among the team that he hadn't encountered in early tests. He got in the regular car of Derek Warwick, who had left to drive for Renault, and was regarded by Toleman engineers as a real star. Senna wasn't. The track was dumb initially, but gradually the day became crisp and pleasant. Ironically, Senna's arch-rival in Formula 3, Martin Brundle, was testing for Canterell Arrows, was also out with Mark Stewart driving. The skepticism lasted as long as it took Senna to complete his second flying lap. The stopwatches told the story. Senna lapped the Nottinghamshire circuit faster than Derek Warwick had ever managed in a Toleman. Despite a problem selecting 5th and 6th gears due to a loose bearing and using less race boost, Senna worked down to an eventual best time on new race tires. It would have been good enough for 8th on the grid at the Grand Prix 4 months earlier.
His attitude.
Alex Hockridge remembers.
Absolutely no problem. The guy did everything we expected of him, and more. I was very impressed with the ease with which he seemed to do everything. He was in complete control from the word go.
Senna did 72 laps before he began to feel sore. He said on the day,
At first I thought I was comfortable in the car. Now I find I wasn't. Look how blistered my palm is. I found the power very impressive in the short gears and very smooth in the top ratios. But on these tires you have to watch the car very carefully even in a straight line, so you can't relax for a second.
He is great. We just need to get him.
Roy Burney cried out in delight. Ted Toleman immediately offered Senna a contract for the next season. But Toleman was a second tire stable and Ayrton didn't give up hope of finding a stronger team. Senna's last hope in the winter of 1983 was Lotus. Ayrton met Peter Warr back in July 1982 at the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch. The Lotus manager liked the Brazilian at the time, and Peter was just about to hand to Colin Chapman, who was known as an incomparable discoverer of racing talent, to invite Senna to the team. But in December 1982, Colin died unexpectedly. Peter Warr at Lotus desperately wanted him to replace Nigel Mansell, with whom he didn't get on. But title sponsor Imperial Tobacco owned John Blair special and wanted a British driver, so Mansell kept his seat, as he did his Italian partner Elio De Angelis, who had an ongoing contract. Who remembers how he was on the brink of signing Senna?
I had Ayrton in my office ready to sign for $50,000 and I told Peter Dyke, the promotions manager of John Player, you have got to do this. He produced the British newspapers on the Sunday morning, which had got headlines Mansell third. They completely omitted the fact that Elio was pole in the same car. So that was justification for keeping Mansell for the following year.
Peter War of Lotus, under pressure from English sponsor Nigel Mansell, had to cancel the agreement that Senna would race with Elio De Angelis. In early November 1983, a dark-haired young man stopped his car on the street in central London and, after hesitating for a second, headed towards the door of the small office of the Toleman F1 team. Behind this door, worldwide fame awaited the unknown Brazilian. But for now, this was just the beginning.